Welcome to the introduction and overview of APTI 419B, Preparation of Fine Particle Emission Inventories. This is the fifth of several modules that introduce the APTI Classroom Course 419B. This module introduces the point source module of the classroom course. This module will cover the importance of point sources, terminology, and legal authorities. We'll discuss state needs such as permits, fees, compliance, state implementation plans, and data interfaces. We'll briefly describe how data are collected and some of the available inventory development resources. Finally, we'll explain the differences between filterable, condensable, primary, and secondary PM. So, why are point source inventories important? Point sources are emissions from facilities included in the inventory as individual entries. Point source emissions are required by the Clean Air Act as amended in 1990, such as found in Section 110, State Implementation Plan requirements, and also by state requirements such as operating permits and compliance programs. Inventories are also required by the Air Emissions Reporting Rule found in AERR in 40 CFR Part 51, published by EPA in December of 2008. And finally, inventories are needed to guide control strategies. How does EPA define a point source? Well, the AERR requires inventory submittal by a point source if it meets the criteria as a major point source under Title V. Plus, all the smaller facilities that a state chooses to include are defined as point sources. Plus, any sources covered by the greenhouse gases or toxic release inventory reporting requirements. Note that emissions of smaller sources not in the inventory should be included in the non-point inventory. But be careful to resolve the inevitable overlap and double counting issues involved with point and non-point data collection. As a refresher, primary particles are emitted directly as particles. In contrast, secondary particle matter forms downwind after emissions. Secondary particles are almost always PM 2.5 or smaller. Secondary particles are not particle emissions. They're gaseous emissions that are called precursors to the particle formation. The precursor gases must be included in the inventory. Point sources may emit either filterable or condensable PM or both. Filterable PM gets its name from those particles caught on a stack test filter, such as modified method 5 filters. They are abbreviated PM-FIL. They are directly emitted and may be solid or liquid. Condensable PM, on the other hand, exists in the vapor phase at stack conditions. It's abbreviated PM-CON. Condensables form solid or liquid particles immediately upon cooling. EPA considers condensables to always be 2.5 or smaller. And remember, PM-FIL and PM-CON are both primary particles. What are some sources of filterable and condensable emissions? Well, combustion sources emit both filterable and condensable PM. Examples include boilers, refinery processes such as crackers, furnaces, kilns, and internal combustion engines. Fugitive dust sources emit only filterable emissions. Examples include agricultural tilling and construction dust. More about fugitive dust later. Fugitive processes in industrial facilities can emit either or both. Metallurgical operations have many examples of fugitive process emissions. PM-Pri or PM-Primary may be reported, or alternatively its component parts, PM-Fil and PM-Con, may be reported individually. Several checks can be made to ensure the consistency of the data. All PM condensables should be in the 2.5 size fraction. And remember that PM10 primary is always greater than or equal to PM 2.5 primary for a particular emissions point. Let's discuss some of the key resources for identifying point sources of PM fine. First, the Emission Inventory Improvement Program Point Source Guidance, Volume 2, lists documents available to PM fine categories. But Existing inventories also make a good starting point, such as prior years, NEI, and toxic release inventory data. Also, agency field inspectors have invaluable knowledge about facilities. They typically know how a particular facility works and what is emitted. And finally, AP 42 and fire contain emission factors. Let's talk a bit more about fire, not the flaming kind, but the factor information and retrieval database. The latest version available is on EPA's chief website. Fire is currently updated to incorporate most revisions to date of AP 42 as of 2010. Watch for ongoing updates. A caution though, fire contains many unevaluated and unrated data and references. We recommend further evaluation before you use any factors that come from fire. The emission inventory development is severely constrained by resources. Funding is needed for testing and methods development to update emission factors. Many factors in fire are old with inadequate documentation. In fact, EPA has done relatively little testing in the past decade. The testing burden has shifted to states and industry. Meanwhile, you're encouraged to test or to require facilities or trade groups to test. Also, to participate in the planning and review of the tests and data. You're encouraged to use the latest, most acceptable test methods and to adopt the EPA format for submitting test data. Share the data is the word of the day. How are data collected from facilities? Historically, special surveys were used to collect facility data. Now, computer-assisted and/or web-based systems are commonly used by facilities to efficiently report directly into state data systems. States provide review and approval. Some such systems also work with state permitting or compliance programs. Not all submissions are annual. The frequency of reporting differs for major and smaller facilities. What will the classroom course cover in more detail? It'll cover uses of point source data, the air emissions reporting rule, emission factors, source testing methods, particle sizing, data handling and submittal, and point and non-point source overlap issues. Let's summarize. Point sources are important and their emissions data are required for use in state and federal programs. Most criteria pollutants and greenhouse gases and some toxics are involved with PM 2.5, either as primary emissions or as secondary precursors. You should coordinate closely with permits, compliance, and others in state local agencies, especially those who inspect and have intimate familiarity with the systems. Emission factors are dated and not always representative. Resource constraints are always an issue. Thanks for your interest in the point source emissions inventory.